now thinking about, well, one of the standard things we think about in the fall and in the spring is mulch. Well, why do we mulch? Well, we mulch to preserve the soil moisture, to conserve the roots and the temperature, and to control weeds. In the winter, we look at putting mulch as insulation for the roots. Remember, the roots are everything in a plant. We love, as gardeners and as citizens, we love above the ground. But above the ground only depends upon how healthy the roots are. So mulch is one of those things that you can do to protect and enhance the roots. Now, it turns out that plants stop taking up water and food when the soil temperature is below 6 degrees centigrade, that's 43 degrees Fahrenheit, or above 30 degrees centigrade, that's 86 degrees Fahrenheit. If you add mulch, you can actually take that span and make the soil warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. So that 10 degrees really helps your root to grow robustly and to continue acting. Plants under stress are undernourished and produce more carbohydrates than proteins. Carbohydrates are the things that pests are attracted to. So mulch becomes a very important part of your health for your plant. In addition to this insulation capability, one of the things that we've learned about bacteria and fungi is that they rest in the ground. If you cover the ground, you reduce the splash potential from the rain. So the raindrops bounce up onto the lower limbs or the lower foliage and thereby infect the plant. By having mulch, you insulate some of that bounce back factor if you just had plain dirt. So it provides some control for those residents in the soil that would otherwise be pathogenic to the plant. And the other thing is it just looks attractive, and it helps with your maintenance because it's a lot easier to mow around a mulchy circle around your tree if you're string trimming, the string around the tree nicks the bark, and that is an access point for bugs and insects and disease to enter the bark. So you want to have that mulch farther out. By putting it around the tree or a bush, you have that separation, and it's easier from a work perspective. So when we think about the goals of what we're doing with mulch, in the spring, we're trying to put mulch on the soil when the soil has warmed up. And generally, the scientists say that you do that around the time when the forsythia blooms in whatever region you're in. Our goals are to retain the moisture in the soil, to reduce the weed growth, and to moderate the soil temperature. It's because you're going from cold to warm. And so you're trying to keep that warm in your soil. In the winter, you apply mulch once the soil is really cooled down. That's before or just after freezing. You need to remove the weeds first. Just mulching a weedy bed is not going to kill the weeds, sadly. The goal for the winter is to add that insulation, because once the soil gets below that temperature, you still want the plant to uptake some water and nutrients. So you want to insulate the roots so they're still able to take up that water. The mulch also adds nutrients and humus to the soil. And importantly, it protects the soil from the freeze, thaw that you see in wintertime, so that sometimes we see plants heaving up out of the ground because of that thawing, freezing activity. the ground is basically throwing the plants up. By adding mulch, you reduce that potential. So what are we thinking about the types of mulch that might be out there? Most of us as gardeners really prefer using an organic mulch. So I'll talk about those first. One of the things we like about organic mulches is that they decompose and add to the soil. They add the nutrients to the soil and they add organic matter that makes the soil healthier. Generally, we think of bark, wood chips, pine straw, and shredded leaves, not full leaves, but shredded leaves. This is where you take all those leaves from your lawn and you run your lawnmower over them and you gather them up and put them into your flower beds. But you can also add shredded newspapers. In fact, I've used just 3 layers of newspaper on an area that I'm particularly trying to clear away and have for a planting bed in the springtime. I add 3 levels of newspaper and then put mulch on top of that so that it keeps that whole area weed free and it adds additional organic matter to the soil. So then I have a better bed to plant in the spring. Now you can also add inorganic materials. People have used stones and they've used landscape fabric. But I found that using stones, you need to underlay the stones with the landscape fabric because stones have a way of moving and getting into the grass or getting into your beds. And you still have to pick out the twigs and leaves and other debris from the stones, which is, I find, harder to maintain. Now, some vegetable gardeners like to put the landscape fabric, cut a hole, and then put their plant inside that hole. For one of the things that landscape fabric does is it's a barrier for water penetration. So you need to think about, if you're going to use landscape fabric, you need to think about how are you irrigating your plants. And many people who use that use a drip irrigation or some kind of an irrigation under the landscape fabric so that your plants get water. Well, how do you mulch? Mulching, this cartoon is looking at a tree, but it could be a shrub or it could be a herbaceous plant. You really are looking at keeping all mulch away from contacting the stem or the branch. The Virginia Tech recommends a 3-inch, 3-inch, 3-foot perspective, 3, 3, 3. So we're looking at having 3 to 4 inches away from the trunk, 2 to 4 inches deep, and 3 feet away from the trunk or the stem, so that you can get a real good, protect that area around the roots. If you plant mulch, and some of us have seen mulch in our communities where the mulch is high, we call the cartoon on the very right volcanic mulch, where the mulch is placed up in a volcanic shape right around the tree bark. Planting mulch around the tree bark really causes a lot of problems because it keeps the bark too wet, and that wetness allows diseases to enter the bark. It also allows boring insects to enter the bark, and it confuses the roots. Roots try to come up to where the level of the bark or soil is, and then because it's not very wide, they start to encircle the tree bark, the tree's root flare. And as they do, it's like putting a necklace and strangling the tree. So this practice of mulching high and up directly against the bark is problematic for the health of the tree. It will cause a gradual decline, and your significant investment in a tree or a bush, you'll just have to, it'll die and you'll just have to take it out. So it's best to keep that away, mulch away from the bark. Now, some people say, well, we want to create this little valley where you have a mulch. It's high, but it's it's pushed away from the bark of the tree itself. That's also not a good practice. When you are seeing a tree, you should be able to see the tree flare, which is where the trunk comes down and the root flares out. You want to see that all the time. So your mulch needs to be on the outside of your tree flare. Looking for more resources on mulching? There are lots of resources. Here are 3 from the Virginia Cooperative Extension, which I found very helpful in communicating the kind of messages that we're talking about. But virtually all cooperative extensions from any state have a lot of information about mulching.